May 11th, 1995.
You are approaching Saturn.
It's the first ever E3 press conference, and Sega takes to the stage to show off the SEGA Saturn, their soon-to-be-released console, only to reveal that said release would be a little closer than expected. While the decision might have made some sense as a means of preventing the PlayStation from potentially picking up a plurality of the market share, given how well it was selling in Japan at the time compared to the SEGA Saturn, in hindsight it was a catastrophic decision. It blindsided retailers who weren't privy to the promotion. The SEGA Saturn was set for a September release date, to the point where K&B Toys dropped SEGA products entirely from their line, giving their shelf space to, the competition that they wanted to get ahead of. Consumers weren't particularly thrilled either, given the high price point of $399 and the fact that the very same press conference where the Saturn bombshell was dropped, they didn't have separate conferences at the time for different console developers, had Sony snap away any supposed head start Sega sought by speaking a single sentence.
$299.
If only they had remembered that when they had decided to make the PS3, $599. A sooner than expected release date also meant there was some time for developers to get their games ready for the console's launch, with all the games launched being made by Sega and not very many of them at that. It might have seemed like a good idea in a vacuum, but this decision, among many others, the Saturn had generally questionable marketing throughout its lifetime, and its hardware made it incredibly difficult to develop games for the system, gave the impression that Sega rushed to launch its console out of nothing more than sheer desperation. It paved the way for the Saturn's swift demise, the console's failure leading not only to the beginning of Sega's eventual exit from the console space, with many of the roadblocks that the Dreamcast would eventually face being in part due to the failures of the Sega Saturn, but much of the Saturn's library being abandoned, stranded on the console, never to be re-released again. While a few exclusives did eventually make the jump in the late 2000s, as digital storefronts became more prevalent, like Guardian Heroes on Xbox Live, Knights coming to Steam, none have proven quite to be as resilient as one of those launch titles, Panzer Dragoon. Receiving 4 sequels across 3 consoles, 2 of which were also on the Saturn, and one recently announced VR title, it has proven to have the most enduring legacy of any Sega Saturn software, in part due to it being given the most attention of all the Saturn games that Sega put out. Which is not to say that the series itself has been particularly well treated, but we'll get to that later. While the series might be more known for Saga or Orta these days, the original Panzer Dragoon is the Sega Saturn game that's been released on more consoles than any other game, with a port on the PC, a re-release on the PlayStation 2, and it was included as a bonus in Panzer Dragoon Orta. It also helps that the original game is fairly solid. For an early Saturn title, it looks great. Its brief campaign is well paced when it comes to going from set piece to set piece, the gunplay, filling the screen with lasers is incredibly satisfying, and its soundtrack is amazing. Yoshitaka Azuma's compositions are some of the finest to ever grace the console, let alone the 5th generation of gaming, capturing the epic scale of this adventure with moment-to-moment musical accompaniments. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. They literally had certain compositions made specifically for a given set piece. It does have some hallmarks of your typical launch game. The campaign is incredibly short. It can be beaten in around an hour if you know what you're doing, and there isn't a whole lot of depth to your firepower or movement. Later games in the series added in some much needed depth to your dragon's abilities, but the first Panzer Dragoon doesn't have anything more advanced to grasp than turning around to shoot from behind. While technically the weakest Panzer Dragoon game, weakest on a home console, it's a testament to how much Team Andromeda ran with a relatively straightforward concept for an arcade shoot-'em-up that's still fun to pick up and play to this day, brief in experience as it may provide. Given its many re-releases, it's not surprising that the first Panzer Dragoon game was given a full-on remake, even though that Zwei would have been a better candidate since it's never been re-released before, but apparently that one's getting remade as well. As is House of the Dead 1 and 2 apparently. It's all being outsourced by Sega to the same duo apparently. Developed by Megapixel Studios and published by Forever Entertainment, Panzer Dragoon's remake was originally announced at the tail end of 2018, alongside the aforementioned sequel, Second Chance, dropping unexpectedly onto the Nintendo eShop on March 26, 2020. I say unexpectedly because development of the game has been radio silent since they unveiled the trailer during that year's E3. It was originally meant to come out in the winter of 2019, but the season came and went, with nary a new release date nor update on its status. On the subject of lacking information, I wasn't able to find out much about Megapixel Studios, their history, the games that they've worked on before. This appears to be the first game that they've ever made. Forever Entertainment, on the other hand, does have a bit of history behind the games that it's published. Mostly shovelware on Steam, which is not a good sign. In any case, it's out now on the Switch, it's coming to Steam at a later point, so how does this latest rendition of a classic stack up? Let's dive into Panzer Dragoon Remake, that's literally the name on the eShop, not Panzer Dragoon, and find out. The story is bare bones and not particularly deep. Our protagonist escaping certain death multiple times, the last one being the result of a dragon rider and its seed saving them before the former collapses, with said protagonist now taking their place in the fight against the Empire. It wouldn't be until Zwei where we started to see a deeper exploration of the characters and the lore. They didn't even bother giving this guy a name, he's just some guy who rides a dragon. It serves its purpose in presenting a premise for our protagonist and a goal for them to pursue, and the remake faithfully follows the original. On the other hand, the gameplay did not see the same level of attention. Ostensibly, this remake shares the same core as the original. You move through the same 7 levels, shooting the same foe after foe by locking on and firing the titular dragon's lasers, and rapidly firing your own gun, but its controls are far less responsive than before, and aiming is far more finicky, which itself stems from the decrease in the size of your aiming reticle. See that tiny square on the screen? No, not that one. Not that one either. This one. This is the area of the screen that an enemy needs to occupy before you can actually hit them in this on-rails shooter. Needless to say, it's a little smaller than before. Because of how pitifully sized your reticle is in this remake, this makes it more difficult just to lock on to anything than it was before. Not that the original had a particularly nasty bite to it, but this tooth is rooted in rather obtuse design decisions where the challenge is filling away trying to hit anything with your puny aim, and less about reflexes and memorization of enemy placement. It can be absolutely frustrating to think you've locked onto an enemy before having to go over the same general area before your aim actually connects. Let me reiterate this. The act of aiming to shoot things is difficult in an on-rail shooter. What's baffling about this is that in the E3 trailer, you can clearly see there's an aiming reticle that's more in line with what was featured in the original, where the larger square would be used to paint the plenty of creatures that plagued our protagonist with a plethora of lasers. I know that over the course of development that things will change and that promotional footage isn't necessarily reflective of the general quality or the mechanics of the final release, but still, it is bizarre to see something done seemingly right reversed such as this. Additionally, turning around with the shoulder buttons is far more sluggish. It makes it more likely that you'll take a hit from an enemy you weren't able to respond to before being fired upon or coming into contact with them. Put together, these changes make for a game that doesn't feel as good to move around and shoot on screen. There is a single solitary change that was made for the better, and that's the twin sticks for the controls. The first SEGA Saturn controller lacked dual analog, so the character moved in the same direction as where you were aiming. In the remake, you can move your character and the target reticle in completely different directions, which is an improvement when it comes to maneuverability. Granted, the original was built around this limitation, so while it's better, it's not exactly a revelation. And it certainly doesn't make up for the shortcomings with the controls. There's not a whole lot else to say about the gameplay. The Panzer Dragoon Remake is more mundane in its failings than it is interesting. It doesn't fix any of the original's flaws, and the changes that were made to the core gameplay result in an experience mildly frustrating more than it is fun. And while I normally don't complain about prices in my reviews, since, digital storefronts prices tend to only go down, $25, $30 plus taxes for Canada, for a not particularly great remake of a game that's fairly short on a system filled to the brim with brilliant remasters and reimaginings that go for the same, if not lower price. Like the Banner Saga Trilogy, that's 3 games, you can get that for about the same price. It's a little hard to justify. Presentation-wise, Panzer Dragoon Remake's cutscenes are faithful to a fault. While the textures received a noticeable update in detail, the actual movement still looks just as stiff as it did in 1995. A sentiment that's shared with the in-game graphics, which are simultaneously overly saturated and somehow less vibrant than the original. It looks better by the mere fact that it's rendered in higher resolution rather than having stronger art direction than the original. The stark contrast in visual fidelity between the two is on full display from the opening level. In the original, the ruins of buildings reflected in the clear oceans as you soared above it all. When you shot down an enemy or one surface from the sea, there would be this great splash of water that would make the sea seem more lively in contrast to the ruins crumbling into it. There was a grit to the visuals in the original Panzer Dragoon that's virtually absent from the remake, whose take on the same level features water that looks lifeless, turgid. The remnants of these ruins rarely reflected in a noticeable manner in the water, and enemies making the most lightest splashes when they enter or exit your view. The environments and the enemies that occupy them feel lifeless in comparison to a game nearly 25 years old. The soul-saving grace is the soundtrack, which remains just as great as ever. Mostly because the tracks are from the original and not rearranged in any way. That's coming via a later update. Maybe when they add in the updated soundtrack, they'll fix the abrupt cutoff of the music during credits. That they're literally patching in a new soundtrack along with several other fixes gives the impression that the remake was rushed, which, while there may be something morbidly fitting about that given the tumultuous history of the Saturn, the impression it creates makes the current state of the game rather repugnant.
Hi there, Future Me here. This update already happened. Yeah, I kind of had to put this review off in anticipation for the Farm 30th anniversary video that I was working on because that one was a lot of work. But my point still stands.
As said earlier, it's a bad remake, but not an especially interesting one due to its own mistakes. What it most reminds me of is that flashback remake Ubisoft published in 2013. It technically retained the basis of the classic, but the merits of the remake are in spite of the changes it made. It came out, people were disappointed in this attempt to celebrate the original, and was forgotten about shortly afterwards. The only major difference between this remake and flashbacks is the greater context. That the Panzer Dragoon Remake's mediocrity is simply the latest chapter in the tragic neglect that the Panzer Dragoon series has suffered throughout the years. From losing the code to the lauded saga, to the paltry palport of Orda, to Panzer Dragoon Mini, the Panzer Dragoon Remake is simply the most fresh step SEGA has taken in its mismanagement of a franchise whose very birth was on a console that suffered from extreme executive meddling. That and the flashback remake at least had the courtesy to include the original game, albeit they managed to screw up its inclusion, but I digress.
If this is the level of quality that one should expect from the upcoming Zwei remake, then it bodes very poorly for the sequel's prospective reimagining. Any strengths that can be attributed to Panzer Dragoon's remake is based solely off of how solid the original game was, and not any of the mechanical or visual tweaks, however slight they may be, that this version has made.
If you really must play Panzer Dragoon, and this is your only option, it's in a playable state, but far from ideal due to the aforementioned controls. If you own an Xbox One or still have your 360 lying around, heck, if you own the original Xbox, Panzer Dragoon Orda offers a much cheaper alternative, plus it comes with a great original game of its own. It's one of the best that I've ever reviewed, and honestly I kind of wish that I went into more detail in my original review about it. Oh, and it's also on Game Pass.
And if you already own the original or one of its various ports, I genuinely don't see what this version of the game has to offer. Heck, it's not like the series' success hinges on it or anything. As I mentioned earlier, they announced a VR title. In any case, Panzer Dragoon Remake earns a 5.5 out of 10. That's all for now, folks. Until next time, game on, my friends.